That first experience and this postulate are not the sole postulates, but a whole circle of postulates opens up. Nature, that is to say, is not merely this wholly free external mode of being in which, as a pure object, consciousness had to realize its purpose. This consciousness is, in its own self, essentially one for which this other free actual existence is. That is, it is itself a contingent and natural existence. This nature, which is for consciousness its own nature, is sensuousness, which in the shape of volition, as instincts and inclinations, possesses a specific essentiality of its own, or has its own individual purposes, and thus is opposed to the pure will and its pure purpose. However, in contrast with this opposition, pure consciousness has rather the relation of sensuousness to it, the absolute unity of the latter with it for its essence. Both of these, pure thought and the sensuous aspect of consciousness, are in themselves a single consciousness, and it is precisely pure thought for which and in which this pure unity is. But, qua consciousness, what is explicit for it is the antithesis of itself and impulses and instincts. In this conflict between reason and sensuousness, the essential thing for reason is that the conflict be resolved, the result being the emergence of the unity of both, a unity which is not the former original, that is, immediate unity of both in a single individual, but a unity which proceeds from the known antithesis of both. Only such a unity is actual morality, for in it is contained the antithesis whereby the self is consciousness, or first is an actual self in fact, and at the same time a universal. In other words, in that unity there is expressed that mediation which, as we see, is essential to morality. Sense of the two moments of the antithesis, sensuousness is sheer otherness or the negative, while on the other hand, the pure thought of duty is the essence, no element of which can be given up. It seems that the resultant unity can only be brought about by getting rid of sensuousness. But since sensuousness is itself a moment of the process producing the unity, that is, the moment of actuality, we have to be content in the first instance with expressing the unity by saying that sensuousness should be in conformity with morality. This unity is likewise a postulated being. It is not actually there, for what is there is consciousness, or the antithesis of sensuousness and pure consciousness. But at the same time, the unity is not an in itself or merely implicit like the first postulate, in which free nature constitutes an element of the unity, and in consequence the harmony of nature with the moral consciousness falls outside of the latter. On the contrary, nature here is that which is an element of consciousness itself, and we have here to deal with morality as such, with a morality that is the active self's very own. Consciousness has, therefore, itself to bring about this harmony and continually to be making progress in morality. But the consummation of this progress has to be projected into a future infinitely remote. For if it actually came about, this would do away with the moral consciousness. For morality is only moral consciousness as negative essence, for whose pure duty, sensuousness, has only a negative significance, is only not in conformity with duty. But in that harmony, morality qua consciousness, that is, its actuality, vanishes. Just as in the moral consciousness, or in the actuality of morality, the harmony vanishes. The consummation, therefore, cannot be attained, but is to be thought of merely as an absolute task, that is, one which simply remains a task. Yet, at the same time, its content has to be thought of as something which simply must be and must not remain a task. Whether we imagine the moral consciousness to be altogether done away with in this goal or not. Which of these really is the case can no longer be clearly determined in the dim remoteness of infinity, to which, for that very reason, the attainment of the goal is postponed. Strictly speaking, we shall have to say that a definite idea on this point ought not to interest us and ought not to be looked for because it leads to contradictions. The contradiction of a task, which is to remain a task and yet ought to be fulfilled, and the contradiction of a morality, which is no longer to be a moral consciousness, that is, not actual. However, the idea that a perfected morality would involve a contradiction would do harm to the sanctity of the very essence of morality, and absolute duty would appear as something unreal. Paragraph 603 is another one of these very, very long passages within the Phenomenology, and there's quite a bit going on here. But we could sum it up by saying that there's a double problematic that is being exposed and not completely resolved here. One of which is how things can be held within the same consciousness. And this is not just a how, but they actually are held within the same consciousness. So it's not a question of how we get from point A to point B when we're stuck at point A. We're already at point B, and we're wondering, how did we get here? How is this actually possible? The second part has to do with what it means for something to be postulated, set out there as a requirement or a demand on the part of thought or consciousness, when in actuality what we are experiencing is an antithesis. So how do we move from the antithesis to what Hegel here is terming a unity? So let's take a look, jump right into the text, since there's so much of it that we need to go through. So in the previous paragraph, 602, we saw that it wasn't so easy to say that duty could simply be opposed to happiness for the individual who is attempting to do his or her moral duty, that in fact there is a postulated or required but not yet actual or realized harmony. That's the term Hegel was using there before, a harmony of nature and morality, or nature and or morality and happiness. Here he says that first experience and this postulate are not the sole postulates, but a whole circle of postulates open up. So now the problem is getting deeper than it had been before, or if not deeper, it is actually deeper, at least more complicated, because there are more figurative balls in the air being juggled around in the dialectic. So he says, nature, that is to say, is not merely this wholly free external mode of being. We saw that before. Nature is a realm of freedom, but it is a freedom that at this point is alien to the freedom of the human being as moral creature, as moral self-maker. He says it's not merely this wholly free external mode of being in which, as a pure object, consciousness had to realize its purpose. What is it then? This consciousness, he says, is in its own self essentially one for which this other free actual existence, the actual existence of nature. Nature where? In the environment? Nature? No. Within the nature of the human being. So this consciousness is essentially one for which this other actual free existence is, that is, he says, it is itself a contingent and natural existence. Every one of us is a contingent and natural existence. What does that mean? A natural existence, and we're going to get into this in just a moment, means that we are bodily, for example. You know, you can say, well, I'm not sure what the resolution to the hard problem of consciousness is. You know, am I my body? Am I my mind? How's the mind and the body connected? Blah, 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 blah. Don't worry about that at this point. Just take stock of the fact that you do, in fact, have this body. And with that comes a certain way of being. Actually, many ways of being. And you do, in fact, have a mind or are a mind. And along with that isn't just pure thought, thinking itself or anything like that. As a matter of fact, that's pretty rare. A little bit of a digression here. Rene Descartes, who many people imagine as, somebody who's doing philosophy all the time, off by himself in his stove-heated room, thinking to himself, carrying out this amazing mental process of abstracting away everything of the body and extension and the senses, and just concentrating his intellect on the purity of thought. Rene Descartes says in a letter, you can do that maybe a month, or you can do that maybe an hour out of a month or a year. Most of the time, we are in fact thinking through, if not our bodies, we're thinking through our brains in large part, we're thinking through our imagination, not a pure intellect, and we are individualized. We are individuals. We have these drives and inclinations, instincts. That's part of what it means to be an individual human being. So he goes on and he says, before that, contingent. What does it mean for us to be a contingent existence? Contingent means that things could be otherwise. I am who I am in the way that I am at this point in time, but that is itself the product not only of environmental factors or genetics, but also my own choices and the choices of other people, how they've impacted on me. All of that could be very, very different. I don't have to be before you giving you this lecture at this point in time about Hegel. I don't have to have ever encountered Hegel in my lifetime. I could be sweeping a floor right now. I could be dead at the bottom of a trench. I could be a million different things. But I happens to have fallen out this way. That's what contingent comes from, cadere in Latin. Things happen to have fallen out that way. Things wound up like that. That's the way my existence is. And much of what I'm concerned with are other contingencies that are going to be going on for the rest of my life. So, what does this pan out with? He says, this nature, which is for consciousness, its own nature, here he introduces a new term, is sensuousness, Sinnlichkeit. This is, in many respects, a technical term, which you're going to find used in philosophy when we distinguish between our rational or intellectual side and the side of sense. Often this is tied in with distinctions between mind and body, or the mental and the corporeal. It's not just in German. It's also found in the Latin philosophers, the Greek philosophers. It's going to be found in French. It's going to be found in English. You're going to find this distinction invoked all over the place. Even by those who are essentially materialists. We'll distinguish between the sensuous, the bodily, and that of the mind, the soul, the psyche, right? So, sensuousness. What does that translate into, he says? He says, in the shape of volition. We're going to come back to that shape in a moment. As instincts and inclinations possesses a specific essentiality of its own, or has its own individual purposes, and thus is opposed to the pure will and its pure purpose. So, let's unpack this. We have instincts, being translated here, Triebe. We could also translate that just as well as is done in the psychoanalytic literature as drives. Trieb means drive. Instinct works all right for that. It's something that we have implanted within us, and we become conscious of it as moving us towards some things, away from other things. Inclinations, Neigungen, literally like, we lean towards some things and we go away from other things. Inclinations works for that. Now, why is this important? Let's dwell for just a second on this. In the previous paragraph, we saw that there's this conflict not just between nature and morality, but between happiness, Glücklichkeit, and morality. The way that Kant defined happiness in that sense is the satisfaction of all of our desires and inclinations, all of the things that we find ourselves wanting. And also we could add the negative to it, not getting the things that we don't want. So this really is about what we think or feel, or at this point in time are convinced is going to make us happy, what happiness consists in for us. Hegel says this is something as individuals we certainly have a almost immediate relationship with. often winds up being more complicated than that when we actually get what we want or we think about how to get what we want. But we'll just say that for the moment. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out here is he says, in the shape of volition. He's using the word Gestalt here. Now, why is that important? Because Gestalt des Bewusstseins is shape of consciousness. And we know that the Hegelian dialectic is, in fact, this entire succession of shapes of consciousness developing out of previous shapes of consciousness through, an antagonistic and dialectical and recuperative process into new shapes. So we have a shape of consciousness here on this side. I don't think that we should just say shape. We should think of this as a shape of consciousness. Now, he also says that it possesses a specific essentiality of its own individual purposes, its own individual Zweck, right? And we saw that Zweck or purpose was very important for the moral consciousness. So we're developing this entire side of nature, the nature of the human being, in this first part of the paragraph. Then he changes things up. He says, in contrast with this opposition, pure consciousness has rather the relation of sensuousness to it, the absolute unity of the latter with it for its essence. Here's where we get to that big theme that I was talking about as the first one that this paragraph is raising. Both of these, pure thought on the one side and the sensuous aspect of consciousness on the other side, are in themselves in a single consciousness. And then he says, and it is precisely pure thought for which and in which this pure unity is. Now, here we get to a very interesting problematic. I, as the moral consciousness, as the human being conscious of being bound by or being obligated or recognizing certain moral duties, am both sides. A little bit later, Hegel is going to present this in terms of the individual being aware that he or she is also at the same time a universal. So this did get very much problematized within Kant's philosophy, and Hegel is taking this up here. If you look at the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, and you look not just at the first two sections, but the third section in which we're moving into the noumenal and trying to understand the very basis of human freedom, that's all on this side, right? This is where the pure will is here. Hegel talks later about reason, but we could also put pure will on here as well. And remember, the will for Kant is, in fact, practical reason. The will can choose whether it is pure practical reason or whether it's going to be bound by sensuousness, in which case it works in a essentially mechanistic fashion, being given its Zweck, its end, its goal, and then just finding the way to that goal. So there's a very interesting background here. The question is, how do I hold these together in my thought at the same time? Now, he's got a suggestion that's being offered to us. That happens on this side, the side of pure thought. That's what makes sense out of it. And if you look at the history of morality up until this point, whether we're looking at it in a Cartesian fashion or a Humean fashion or in Kant's way, in general, I mean, there's a few exceptions to this. It's usually the thinking part of us that's going to work out all of this. The thinking part understands the sensuous part. The sensuous part does not understand the thinking part. Hegel's going to try to get us beyond this. He says, or rather, he's going to chart out a process by which humankind actually went beyond this. He says, qua consciousness, what is explicit for it is the antithesis of itself and impulses and instincts. So he says we've got a conflict here between reason and sensuousness. The essential thing for this reason is that the conflict being resolved. The result being the emergence of a unity of both. A unity which is not the former original unity of both in a single individual, but a unity which proceeds from the known antithesis of both. So this is well worth dwelling upon. It's not a unity that you can just assume and say, well, look, they're both in the human being, so somehow it must all work out. That is not the case. Anybody who's ever experienced a genuine crisis of conscience knows that there can be a terrible conflict within us between duty and sensuousness or happiness or nature, right? So how can we, in fact, attain this unity? This is where, in typical Hegelian fashion, it cannot just be a unity that reconciles everything, places everything into its proper pigeonhole, and then tells you, go there for this sort of thing, go there for this sort of thing. We can't just divide the entire moral world up into what falls on this side and what falls on this side. It is a project yet to be attained, and it's one that has to take into account the full antithesis, or Gegensatz, the contradiction between duty, morality on one side, and happiness, or our inclinations and drives, instincts, volition, sensuousness on the other side. So, he says, only such a unity is actual, wirklich, morality. For in it is contained the antithesis whereby the self is consciousness, or first is an actual self in fact, and at the same time a universal. That's the passage that I brought up earlier. We are at the same time a universal, a sort of stand-in for everybody. Everybody should behave the way that I do. Everybody should understand as I do. And we are an individual, and the individuality is the basis for us even being conscious in the first place. So he goes on and he says, in that unity, there's a mediation, which is essential to morality. A mediation essential to morality. Keep that thought in your mind. So then he says, of these two moments of the antithesis, sensuousness is sheer otherness or the negative, pure thought of duty is the essence, no element of which can be given up. It seems that the resultant unity can be brought about by getting rid of sensuousness. This is one of the ways in which we try to do it. One way in which that happens is you say, sensuousness, that's just this mechanistic world outside. That's the phenomenal world that we're caught up in. Just resist it. Don't take any cues from it. Don't even exercise prudence or pay attention to, these general imperatives, which are still yet hypothetical. It just happens they apply to everybody, every human being who ever existed. This is Kant in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. That's one way to do it. Hegel does not think that's going to work. He goes on and he says, since sensuousness is itself a moment of the process producing the unity, since it's there and it's part of the process, we can't get rid of it. We have to be content with expressing the unity by saying, here's another possibility, saying that sensuousness should be in conformity with morality. Morality, once again, supervenes on the sensuousness, guides it, tells it how it ought to behave. Okay, is that going to settle things for us? Now, here's where he brings in postulation again. He says that unity is likewise a postulated being. It's not actually there. It doesn't yet exist. What is there? He says, well, consciousness, the antithesis of sensuousness and pure consciousness. Being conscious of this conflict within one's own consciousness, and of the fact that you're stuck with these two, antagonistic forces or aspects or whatever they are within you, because they are you. You can't get away from them. You cannot escape this antithesis. So he goes on and he says, this unity is not an in itself or merely implicit, like the first postulate, in which free nature constitutes an element of the unity, and in consequence, the harmony of nature with the moral consciousness falls outside. On the contrary, something different is happening here, right? Nature is that which is an element of consciousness itself. Here we have to deal with morality as such. A morality, he says, that is the active self's very own. We cannot eliminate or subordinate either side. They are both equally what we are. They both equally, though in different ways, make a contribution to the very possession of moral consciousness as an individual, which is the only way that I can have moral consciousness, as this individual who I am. So, he says, consciousness, therefore, has to bring about this harmony and continually be making progress in morality. That's worth dwelling upon. It has to continually make progress in morality. That means that morality is not something that we attain as a finished state where we've, again, to use the metaphor, we've checked off all the boxes. Well, I didn't lie. I fulfilled all my promises. I showed gratitude to those who are benefactors to me. I distributed things justly. That's not at all the way morality really works. It's more like a constant challenge where, like, each day you'd have to be like, you could do the checklist and you could say, well, I didn't lie to anybody, although I sure as hell was tempted to lie in this circumstance. Got to work on that. I could have been better in distributing resources justly. There was a situation there that was a bit, complex, and I think I might have made a wrong snap decision about that. I'll have to reassess that and maybe see if I can fix that in the morning and go on and on and on like that. We never actually reach the limit point where there is a genuine unity or harmony integrating all of these things together completely. So he says the consummation of this progress has to be projected, notice where it's projected, into a future infinitely remote. Now here's an interesting thing to say. If it did come about, this would do away with the moral consciousness. Why would it do away with the moral consciousness? Because then there would no longer be this conflict or antithesis or contradiction between sensuousness or nature and pure thought of duty. Kant does in fact consider something like this within his book, Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, in talking about the genuinely good, pure will, the holy will. That is really not for us. It's something we can strive towards, but it's not our condition. So why does Hegel say that morality, the moral consciousness, would go away? He says, morality is only moral consciousness as negative essence, for whose pure duty sensuousness has only a negative significance, is only not in conformity with duty. So in that harmony, he says, morality qua consciousness, that is, its actuality vanishes. Just as in the moral consciousness or in the actuality of morality, the harmony vanishes. So that's a little bit of a complicated sentence. Let's take the second part first. The harmony in actual morality as we're living it out in our day-to-day life, making decisions, trying to fix the screw-ups that we've done with those decisions afterwards, is a constant process of trying to figure out how we reconcile these things that seem to be basically a bad fit with each other, and they're all stuck within our consciousness. If we did, in fact, reconcile all this sort of stuff, we would lose the moral consciousness, Hegel says. It would no longer, we would have consciousness, but it would no longer be moral consciousness. So he says, this consummation cannot be attained, but is to be thought of as an absolute task, one which remains a task. Now, this is a problem, right? Because from the Hegelian perspective, anything that can't be made actual is deficient in some way. So he says, its content has to be thought of as something which simply must be and must not remain a task. Here's the postulation coming back again. Whether we imagine the moral consciousness to be altogether done away with in this goal or not. So, where are we left? Here he tells us, which of these really is the case can no longer clearly be determined in the dim remoteness, as he says, of infinity, to which the attainment of the goal is postponed. Strictly speaking, we have to say that a definite idea on this point ought not to interest us, ought not to be looked for, because it leads to contradictions. The contradiction of a task, which is to remain a task and yet ought to be fulfilled. Right? There's a paradox there. It's a task that ought to remain a task, and it also ought to be fulfilled. Which value are we going to have for it? If you attain it, then it still has to be fulfilled. If it still has to be fulfilled, it's to be fulfilled by actually attaining it. He says there's also a contradiction of a morality, which is no longer to be a moral consciousness, that is not actual. Now notice, when he's saying not actual, for Hegel, morality is not attained just when everything is being done the right way. We have to be conscious of doing things the right way because we choose to do them the right way, and we recognize the moral values that require us to go against those sides of ourselves that stand in the way of it. There must be, you might say, resistance, a resistance that comes out of our very individuality to the universality of morality, or else we do not have moral consciousness. We just have a realization of a moral state of affairs, which is no longer morality. So he finishes up here by saying the idea of perfected morality would involve a contradiction, would do harm to the sanctity of the very essence of morality, and absolute duty would appear as something unreal. So we not only have these contradictions at this level, there is a meta-contradiction of, wait a second, morality is something rational, shouldn't be beset with all these contradictions. Can we find a way out of them? That's what we're going to see in the paragraphs to come.